people for 31 more years. It's between this building our careers, raising families, and that stage of frail old age, that this is a new stage that didn't exist before. My grandparents didn't have this. They, when they got to be my age, they moved to Florida, and that was it. I lived in Boston. People in Boston moved to Florida. And it turns out that this is a new stage, not just for people who are technically boomers, but it's actually a new life stage. My millennial children will someday be between building their careers and raising their families and frail old age. And what is this stage of life that many of you are also in? What's it about? So in this listening campaign, we asked people what keeps you up at night and what gets you up in the morning. What are your fears and what are your concerns? The fears were that people would become invisible. They wouldn't be seen anymore, that people would be isolated, that people would be without purpose, and that people would be dependent. And a ton of issues emerged. Issues like, as communities are changing, our friends move away, kids, if we have them, move away too. With whom do I want to grow old? How do I think about this stage of my life? And in what kinds of settings? Do I want to age in place, stay in my home or apartment? Do I want to move to a retirement community? Do I want to share a house? So all kinds of issues around community, building community. A second series of issues had to do with changing relationships. How do I navigate the way friendship changes as you get older? The people that were your friends when you were younger, if you drove carpool or whatever, they're not necessarily in your life anymore, they've moved away. How do we nurture long-term friendships? How do we make new friends at this stage of life? How do we let go of toxic friendships? How do we deal with older parents or some of us millennial children? So those were a lot of issues that emerged. Then there was a series of issues about how do I become the 85-year-old woman that I want to someday be? What do I need to do to stay alive, curious, engaged? What kind of spiritual practices, what kinds of work on myself should I be doing now in order to become that 85-year-old? A whole bunch of questions around new rituals, which maybe we'll talk about later on. What is a way of marking the Jewish moments of this stage of my life? Of course, there were a lot of issues around illness. How do I deal with illness, my own or that of my friends? And what do I need to do to get ready for the inevitable end of life issues? So these conversations sparked Richie and me to begin to think about writing a book. And for him, it was really a very easy idea because, as Rabbi Eger said, he was the co-editor of the first Jewish catalog, which was for me, that was the 60s and 70s, and now I'm in my 60s and 70s, and we needed a toolkit then, and we need a toolkit now. And so the idea of making this book remind you of the Jewish catalog, and it's actually quite intentional, obviously, the same colors and the same kind of whimsical cartoons around the edges. All of this was intentional to help people who still need a toolkit, but a different kind of toolkit now that we're older. So that's why we wrote the book.
Well, that's really interesting to figure it out. So what was the most surprising thing then that you learned while writing it and collating it?
So this is something that I'd be very curious to talk with you all about, and that is how hard it is to name this stage. What do you like to call yourself? So Rabbi, I don't know if you can just show us the gallery view again, but I would like to ask you to raise your hand. Those of you that like being called seniors, raise your hands. Can you see how many hands are raised? Because I'm not looking, I can't see.
A few.
A few.
Probably maybe only less than, probably say an eighth.
How many of you don't like to be called seniors?
Yeah, that's most of the hands.
Most of the hands. Those of you that don't like to be called seniors, do you like those senior discounts that you get at movies in those days when we could still go to the movies?
Yeah, you got a lot of thumbs up there. A lot of smiles.
But so, like, what do you call yourself? Do you want to call yourself an elder? Raise your hand if you like being an
I like
elder.
elder. That sounds wise to me, you know.
How many of you like that? Raise your hand. How many hands
A few, a few.
how many of you really don't like that?
Yeah, you got more on the don't likes.
Okay, so I would guess that the don't like the word elder because it sounds too much like elderly. And we're not elderly. We are in this stage of being an active older adult. And it turns out that it's not a chronological age because some of us have different kinds of physical challenges at this stage, right? So that it's not, and it's not technically boomers because some people in their 80s are still very actively engaged, active older adults. So what do you call us? Retired? No,
Old fart.
old fart, right? Not all of us worked, so we're not technically retired. Rewired, seasoned, younger, older, as opposed to older, older. The third chapter, the encore generation. The fact that we can't even name this is part of the problem. We can't name this stage. And so it's hard for us to name our own experience of it. That was one thing that surprised us. Another thing that really surprised me was how important friends are at this stage of life. In 1993, Betty Friedan, who you all know wrote the Feminine Mystique, she was on to this. She wrote a book called The Fountain of Age. It's not a very good book because it's way too long. I mean, I guess she was an important enough and a difficult enough person that editing her was complicated. So the book is too long. But in it, she says, more and more psychologists have found that for older persons, loneliness is not necessarily linked to the death of a spouse or to how infrequently they see their children or grandchildren, but to the absence of personal relationship with peers, friends of their own age or any age, who share their interests and with whom they sustained their roots of shared experience. So friendship, hugely important. And I don't think we were completely aware, although there's some interesting chapters in there about friendship. One of the things that has come out for me, and Rabbi Eger, I'd be curious as to your response to this, is you all know that in Jewish tradition, a mourner technically is a parent, a sibling, a partner, or a child. Friends are not technically mourners, but all of us know that when somebody who's been a friend for a very long time dies, we really are mourners, but our voices are not necessarily involved in the planning of the funeral, and it's hard for us to know how to mourn. So one of the things that I think challenges us, particularly liberal rabbis, is how do we acknowledge the importance of friendship and kind of build it into rituals of mourning? Do you have thoughts about that?
That's so interesting that you say that because we at Kolami have for a long time, I think we were affected particularly by the AIDS crisis, and so people took care of folks who weren't there, those particular orders, and of course those were years where LGBTQ people couldn't get married. So our Kaddish list has a significant number of friends, and we do say Kaddish for friends because we know that our families of choice are often, we're closer to them than our biological family sometimes. And I think if the friendships that you're talking about, particularly at this stage when children may live far away or grandchildren coming, your community becomes your family of choice, I think. So I think that's a very important part of this configuration.
So it's something that I think other congregations can learn from yours, because I think in other congregations it's not so obvious, but it's really absolutely essential. So that was a surprise. Another surprise was how much in denial we all are about growing older. Not only is ageism real out there in the world, but it's really real inside of ourselves, the kind of internalized ageism that people have. And how much we pretend that we're not getting older, and how much that gets in the way of our really owning the truth of this moment, which is that, you know, to be alive means that we're getting older, and it's important to acknowledge it and to translate that truth into something hopeful and optimistic instead of pretending that it isn't happening. Another really big surprise was how hard it is for people of our cohort to ask for help. It turns out that people are quite willing to give help, but not so willing to ask for help. Um, and that, I think, is really a challenge. And I think that has actually been changed by the pandemic. But, you know, certainly before the pandemic, people, particularly in our privileged universe, you know, I don't need help, when in fact, sometimes we do. And how do we change cultures so that we can actually feel good about asking for help? Another surprise was how few people have shared their end of life wishes with anyone beyond their doctor or their lawyer. Those of us who have adult children, so many have not talked to our adult children. And folks who don't have adult children, who should you be having these conversations with? And are you having them? That's a surprise. And now all of these questions, I would love to hear your feedback on. So Denise, interrupt or whatever as I go through that. But that was a big surprise. Responses to that?
Well, I think one of the things, if we're having a conversation about this, is particularly this issue of end of life decisions. It's so scary for people to think about what do I want to have happen after I die? How do I want? No, how do I want to be remembered? What kind of rituals do I want my friends and family to observe if there's Jewish rituals? And then simply making your wishes known. People don't talk about it. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation, I'm sure you too, Rabbi Geller, and we get the call that someone in our community has died, but we don't have any idea whether they have a cemetery plot or they prefer cremation and they want a memorial service or what they want. And I think particularly when there are not adult children is a very, very serious. Who is going to help take care of the details? Because there are a lot of details, not just with the funeral service, and I'll just say this, we're deciding what's going to happen with the deceased, but of course all the legal issues, right? Will, trust, estates, all of that. So I think those are some very serious issues.
But even if you have adult children, if you haven't talked to them about it together and they disagree, you set the future of toxicity in a family that is irreparable. So, you know, whatever our family constellations are, you know, families of choice or families that we grew up in or that we, you know, with our own children, having these conversations is really critical, and people just don't have them. And on both sides, there's resistance to having them. And the book, interestingly enough, is actually, as I said, it's a toolkit, and it walks you through how you have those conversations. Again, this book is not a sermon. This book is an actual toolkit. You want to know how to have those conversations? You turn to the chapter that deals with how to have those difficult conversations, and it walks you through it. Another issue that is really critical and was a surprise was how real the epidemic of loneliness is. You know, many of us, whatever we did before we retired, your social capital constricts once you retire. You know, and the universe of all the people that you were engaged in gets smaller and smaller. It turns out, but not just for us, but particularly for us, people are lonely. There was a study in 2004 that 1 in 4 Americans had no one in their life with whom they could confide. The former US Surgeon General, this guy named Vivek Murthy, wrote, "Loneliness and social isolation are associated with a reduction in lifespan similar to that of smoking 15 cigarettes a day and even greater than that associated with obesity." He just wrote a new book called Together, the Healing Power of Human Connections in a Sometimes Lonely World, which I have not read, but I hear is quite terrific. England appointed a minister of loneliness because it is such a serious issue. And what would social policy look like if it really recognized how important loneliness is? That, you know, we have a bunch of epidemics going on. One is the pandemic, and the other is this epidemic of loneliness.
Excuse me, Rabbi Eger, as you know,
Al, we're going to wait for just
okay.
till the end for questions, okay?
Okay, that's
All right,
fine.
great.
Okay, so a couple of other surprises. One is how myopic the Jewish community is about us. The Jewish community officially, I think, believes that the Jewish future is about families with young children, about millennials, and it does that very well. The Jewish community also does frail old age very well, but it basically ignores us, which is really stupid because we are a population of people who are engaged, some of us. We have, some of us, discretionary time, discretionary resources, a real desire to serve and to give back. And if the Jewish community doesn't pay attention to us and doesn't help us find ways to be engaged, if synagogues don't pay attention to us, we're not going to be around the Jewish community, and that is bad for the Jewish community.
Laura, I want to ask about that that issue a little bit. And I noticed there was a big chunk towards the end of the book really about that very issue of the engagement in society, re-engagement in a different way, volunteerism, activism. Can you speak? You've been an activist all your life, particularly around women's issues and other progressive issues. Maybe you can share a little bit more about that aspect and a few thoughts about how we might do that in this time.
Right. So being without purpose was one of the 4 fears. Being invisible, being isolated, being without purpose, and being dependent. Being without purpose is really a big fear because if you have nothing to get up in the morning for, there's no reason to get up. So how do you continue to maintain a life of purpose when you're no longer engaged with raising children, if you ever were, when you're no longer engaged with a full-time career, if you ever were? How do you do that? And it's particularly challenging now, and it's particularly challenging for people who were active in the 60s and 70s. I don't know you all, but I would guess that many of you, were activists in the 60s and 70s, and you're used to being on the streets and being involved in social justice issues. And, certainly your community has been leaders in the issue of changing the way people think about gender and sexuality. And I mean, every important issue around those concerns, you guys have been leaders. How do you keep doing that now? And now, particularly with what's going on in terms of racial issues in our country, we who used to be on the streets, we who were the leaders, it's not our turn anymore, right? Well, how do we acknowledge that there's a new generation and that we want to encourage that new generation, and that maybe our job is to listen more and talk less and educate ourselves about things that maybe we haven't been paying enough attention to, like issues of our own privilege and ways in which our implicit bias has enabled the systemic racism that we all are beginning to acknowledge. How do we look at that? What should our congregations be doing in terms of what we should be reading and what we should be talking about and all of that? And how do we do this work from our homes? I can't be on the street now. So what can I be doing? Well, one thing I can be doing is listening, reading, and really trying to examine, what I can do as an older adult who has wisdom, but at the same time, the fact that Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel marched together in Selma is very nice, but it isn't sufficient for me to step back and say, been there, done that, I'm done with my responsibility, because we're not done. We have to figure out how to do it differently now.
That's sage, I guess we should say that's sage advice for this. I guess I want to switch gears a little bit, and you mentioned earlier about creating rituals for this new stage. I know you've been involved throughout your career in creating rituals and talking about women's rituals and infusing Judaism with the feminist viewpoint. Can you give us some insight about ritual creation for this stage of life?
So here's where really I think, our experience, yours and mine, particularly out of the early or the feminist, Jewish feminist movement of the 70s and the 80s. When I went to religious school, and probably when you did too, when you studied about the life cycle, the life cycle ceremonies that you learned about were, there was Brit Milah, and then in the 70s, covenant ceremonies for daughters. There was Pidyon Haben, redemption of the firstborn son, sometimes redemption of the firstborn child. There was bar mitzvah, then there was bat mitzvah, there was confirmation, then there was marriage, if there was marriage, and then sometimes there was divorce, if there was divorce, and then nothing. The next life cycle ritual that happens after that, beginning of raising families, building careers, is funeral. Ironically, I will live, God willing, many more years between when I first got married and when I have my funeral than between when I was born and when I first got married. And, you know, if Judaism believes, as we say that it does, that there's no important moment of the lifetime of a Jew for which there is no blessing, you know, well, what about these moments? What are the moments in this stage of our life where, however we understand divinity, where we need to celebrate, to acknowledge, to mourn, you know, what are those moments? And we learned from the feminist movement that my experience is Jewish experience, even though it wasn't written down in any rabbi's manual. Our experience, what we are going through, is Jewish experience, and it's up to us to name those moments, and then it's up to us to figure out how to create ways to acknowledge those moments. So the book does not script these.
Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed you don't offer any.
No, we don't offer any rituals, but what we do offer is a way to think about creating ritual. So, you know, if we were not virtual, or maybe we could do a little of this now, you know, I would ask you, maybe we could unmute people and just ask people, or to put in the chat, what are some moments in your lives now that you think are worthy of exploring the possibility of ritual? Why don't we do that? Why don't people
Put
just
it in the chat? Why don't you guys put it right in the chat there, if you want to share in the chat some things that you might think would be good moments in this stage of life to ritualize and to create a ceremony for.
Okay, so as you do that, then the question is, how do you create a ritual and make it feel Jewish, right?
Right.
That's what we try to do in the book. We give you the kinds of questions you ought to think about. When should it be? Where should it be? Who are the witnesses? What are the ritual objects? What are the texts? What are to think about what's the food? What's the smell? And to think about how you actually create those rituals.
Okay, so here's some that are written about when both parents die. I'm an orphan, regardless of how old I am.
Exactly.
Children. Wendy Hartman writes children's mitzvahs. Do you mean your children's bar bat mitzvah, or I guess I'm not clear which mitzvahs, Wendy. Why don't you clarify that in the chat?
I was just meaning that our children go through the same cycle of mitzvahs and events, and
yes,
and for us, it's still a good happening, you know, exciting thing for us as well. So
that's a really interesting point. If you were to ask some more traditional people why there are no rituals that are prescribed for this stage of life, they would say, now we're going through them as the, you know, as parents and grandparents. You know, what's true about that is that it's true if you happen to be a parent or a grandparent. What's not good about it is, what if you're not a parent? What if you're not a grandparent? Is there no way in which there are these moments in your lives independent of your roles as parent or grandparent? It's something to think about.
Here's a couple more that are really great. When you become an empty nester and you fully launch the kids, and Sherry Ludwig writes, reconnecting with extended family, i.e. family reunions. And Judith Jacobs writes, as a single woman living far from my family and cemetery, how do I arrange for my funeral in a Jewish way?
Okay, so those are all really important questions.
Retirement. Somebody else wrote retirement.
Okay, so retirement is generally thought of as a secular experience. But what would it mean to say, well, there's divinity present in that too? What would it mean for your congregation once a year or once every 6 months or whenever it happens to celebrate with somebody who has retired. And to find a way to do that in a Jewish way. I mean, there's a lot of interesting texts in Torah about essentially retiring, about finishing a stage and moving on to a next stage. How might you do that? And the thing about ritual, all life cycle rituals, even the most joyous, also include loss, and particularly at this stage of life. So retirement is often, a joy, but it's also a loss, right? You're losing status. And so how do you manage that? And how could ritual help you? I mean, a really good example is one of the hardest things for people of our generation, of our cohort, is when we can't drive anymore. And you have to give up the keys because it's not safe. Many of you who have dealt with older people that you love have gone through this with them, and they experience it as a loss of independence. There's often a lot of tension around it. Is there a way to reframe that so that when somebody is ready to acknowledge that they shouldn't be driving anymore, that that's a sign that they are wise and that we celebrate them, and that there's some way in which a ritual and we also help them find other alternatives about how else you can get around if you can't drive anymore. So that's a significant kind of example. And in each community, it might look different. When I create these rituals, is it something just for me and my friends? Who's the audience for it? When after Richie died, after the first year, I created a ritual for taking off my wedding ring. And I thought about it a lot. Who should be there? Is it something I wanted to do at the synagogue? Is it something I want to do in my home? It was very powerful. And it signaled to me that I was, as much as I loved him, I was no longer his wife. And I wanted to signal that to myself and to my community. And the actual thinking about it and then the creation of the ritual is really an important dimension of my moving forward in my life now as a widow. So that's, I think, an example of how we think about creating new rituals. And I think it would be fun for you all to imagine what are some of the issues that you're all dealing with, and maybe a small group of you to come together and think about creating something for one of these issues. Ritualize signing a planned giving contract. I mean, what a wonderful idea that is. One of the issues of the book is, what is our legacy? What do we want to leave? And one of the things we think about when we think about legacy is how we give away. Well, giving away money, whether we're rich or not rich. And what a wonderful thing to imagine celebrating that. So these are great ideas. As a single woman living far from my family, how do I arrange for my funeral in a Jewish way? We have a chapter in the book about that. And it's really hard to do by yourself. So read the chapter and bring a friend to the cemetery and really deal with the issue of how, do you want to be buried? Do you want to be cremated? What are the pros and cons? If you want to be buried, how much does it cost? When should you be buying property? All of these kinds of issues. We will all die at some point, and it's just really not smart to not really think about it in advance, so that when that time comes, those people who love us are much clearer about what they should be doing.
Beautiful. I want to shift gears a little bit. How did you choose? Like you and Richard wrote a lot of the chapters and a lot of the material. How did you but there are others that contributed. Some really notable people. Sylvia Borstein has a chapter. Rabbi Elliot Dorff has written stuff. Tell us how you chose some of the others to contribute to this wonderful book.
We knew what we knew, and we knew what we didn't know. And we made a list of everything that should be in the book. And then we thought, who do we know who knows more about this than we do? And we asked them to write chapters. Part of the harvest of this stage of our life is that we know a lot of people who've been part of our separate and joint lives for a long time. And we reached out to them, and many of them had some connection to the Jewish catalog. And so they were excited to to help us with this project. The chapter that Elliot Dorff wrote about end-of-life decisions, only he could write that chapter. I mean, you know, he is the expert on it. The chapter about visiting the sick. Bill Cutter, Rabbi Bill Cutter, wrote that chapter. Subsequent to writing the chapter, he himself has had some more challenges with illness, and he wants to rewrite the chapter now so that it takes more into consideration the experience of the person who is being visited as opposed to just the visitor. You know, so that's how we, some people we didn't know at all. I mean, we knew that we needed a chapter on friendship, and we went to somebody who I only knew peripherally, wrote a chapter. We wanted to do something about downsizing. We found that person on online, and then it turns out that our circles, we actually knew her from 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And there would be new chapters if I were writing it now.
So tell us about those. If given everything that's happened, tell us a little bit about what you would add in the addendum, maybe the next edition, the new edition, since this book has been such a success. It's the National Jewish Book Award winner, this book, for 2019. What are the additional things you would write about and add in?
Well, you know, I think that one of the things that has happened because of the pandemic is that people like us who used to be invisible, we're not invisible anymore. I said that one of the issues is, you know, pretending that we're not getting older. You can't do that anymore. Anybody who's 60 or older, we have our own hour at Trader Joe's, right? I mean, you can't pretend anymore that you're not getting older. And the pandemic has revealed stereotypes and ageist attitudes about boomers. In some way, those attitudes have worsened. There was for a minute in social media a meme, boomer remover, that the pandemic was a boomer remover. That is to say, that people like us would die, and that would be okay because, you know, we would be out of the way, and the next generation would be able to kind of inherit all the stuff that we screwed up. The guy who's the lieutenant governor of Texas, this guy Dan Patrick, he actually said, those of us who are 70 plus, we'll take care of ourselves, but don't sacrifice the country for us. Translation, you know, my life doesn't quite mean the same thing as the life of a younger person. Now, that's beginning to change a little bit as we see the pandemic is not just affecting older people more than younger people. So this issue of tension between generations has emerged. The other thing that has emerged, though, is the need for intergenerational connections. Some of us have older children who've moved home, and they're living with us. And many of us could not be functioning without the support of younger people in our life who are going shopping for us. So the possibility of intergenerational connectedness is something that we didn't think about when we wrote the book. There's nothing about multi-generational stuff in the book. And I think that that's an important issue that has emerged because of the pandemic. The loneliness issue, you know, we should have done a lot more with that because it is so critical, especially now. I live alone. It's hard living alone. It's hard living alone. I mean, and so what are the ways that we can create the community that enables people who are living alone and will continue to not be able to see each other for a long period of time? I think there's a lot more that we need to think about together as a community about that. Another thing that I would do differently is write about technology. Who knew that technology was so important, that our lives now would depend on Zoom? And, you know, in our work with older people through High Village LA, a lot of people are kind of still struggling to figure out how to get on Zoom. How do you train people? The whole issue of making technology more accessible, encouraging whoever it is that's creating technology to recognize that some people don't see as well as other people, some people don't hear as well as other people. How do we create technology that really works for people as we get older? And then I would want to think about how to use technology to stay connected. How could you use WhatsApp? How can you use Facebook? How can you use the telephone to reach out to people who are lonely? Is a buddy system so that everybody in a particular synagogue or community regularly gets called.
So it's so funny. It's so funny that you said that. For out of this pandemic, we did just that. We created a buddy system. Everybody who wants one in our congregation has a buddy to check in with. Precisely do that. We didn't do that before, but this time has really necessitated that everybody has someone they can check in with.
And I bet you that is life-saving. That is
For many people. For many people, it is.
Nice, but it's life-saving. And it's life-saving even after the pandemic is over. We need these kinds of connectedness. And as I said before, it's really hard to ask. Nobody wants to admit that they're lonely. And so we need to create the mechanisms for people to have that kind of connectedness. So those are things that I would have written differently.
Well, I'm just going to give everybody the 2 minute. We're going to ask one more question. I'm going to ask one more question of Rabbi Geller, and then we're going to open up, and you can ask Rabbi Geller your questions or share some of your thoughts to the questions that she's been raising. We'll try and do it in a bit of a way. If you can raise your hand, I'll try and get us to be able to do that. Laura, you wrote a recent article in E-Jewish Philanthropy about responding that describes the problems, especially in light of coronavirus, of how the Jewish community could do better, particularly around some of this intergenerational stuff, the always focus of Federation. How many teens do you have? How many young people do you have? When, like in our congregation, we just filled out some grant application for the Federation. We, in our congregation, are primarily an adult congregation. We have maybe 20 kids between the ages of 18 and 4 or 3, and most of our people are adults. So like we also have a young adult 20s and 30s community thriving. So maybe you could share a little bit about more of that for all of us.
Well, the first thing is to be seen. So this pandemic someday will end. Right now, there is a focus on us. What would we like the Jewish community to look like when this is over, so that people of our age cohort feel visible, no longer isolated, able to give back, and not dependent. Well, one of the things is changing our own attitudes. I mean, turns out that nobody is ever independent. Throughout our lives, we're always interdependent. How do we reframe Jewish communal experience so that interdependence is viewed as the goal? What would it look like? And just to imagine what it would look like. So basically, we wrote this article, me and a colleague in New York, and we're now trying to figure it out. We're talking to people who do work in this age cohort. One of the things that David, who's on the call, David is my partner in working on a project called the Synagogue Village Network, where we're trying to take what we learned from High Village LA and help other synagogues around the country try to create this kind of more intense community. Maybe this is a moment where other synagogues are going to look to the models that are actually working for this age cohort, and maybe we can help them do it better. Technology, who are the people that are creating technology, and how do we get them to think about not just when I fall that I have a buzzer to press. That's an important piece of technology for me living alone in my house, right? What is the other kinds of new technologies that need to be invented for people like me? For example, right, if you don't drive anymore and you call Lyft or Uber, when it's safe to do that, that's fine. But what if you don't have a smartphone? Turns out there's an organization called Go Grandparents where you can reach them through a telephone number. Brilliant. Somebody's making money off of every call, but it's really important because there are some of us who don't have smartphones. So what are the technological fixes that we need to be exploring? So I don't know what the answer is, but I know that this is the moment where we have to keep this in the face of the Jewish community. I was upset that when the Federation announced its grants around COVID, the word older adults not mentioned. You know, no surprise. You know, we've got to keep it in the face of people who are funders. And I think part of the way that we do it is by that activism that we grew up in. You know, we are not dead yet, and we need to be tended to by, we need to, you know, learn something from those Gray Panthers. Remember them? I mean, you know, we are a group of people with agency, with resources. If we are attentive to that, I think we can make change.
Beautiful. That's really powerful. Well, I'm going to have everybody at this moment, if you can raise your hands. I see Wendy Hartman. If you want to unmute yourself, Wendy, and ask your question for Rabbi Geller.
Okay, I'm going to make a point too. One of the things you addressed early on was in documents and planning, when people are putting together their documents. I do estate planning, and I have a lot of clients who don't have anybody to name as their healthcare directive. And it kind of gave me an idea to look to congregations like this. And maybe there are people that they can reach out to in congregations, and maybe the congregation itself might have a committee that helps address these kind of things for people.
I want to share actually. This is a very, very powerful point. Two people. Friday night, one of our congregants, our board members, lit candles in memory of someone who used to work for him. She had no family, and he was involved in taking care of her and ensuring her care, and someone else who was someone that she had met through a business transaction, and they became friendly, and between the two of them, they were the ones that ended up caring for this woman and through her end stages of life, and in terms of making sure she had the resources she needed. And it's quite a beautiful story. So Wendy, it's exactly kind of like what you're talking about in terms of getting others in the communities in which you're with to embrace and to share those responsibilities. Quite beautiful.
And I'm going to push you even further. It is the role of a congregation to make that happen, right? The whole notion of these buddies, what if part of the assumption of a regular contact with somebody through the congregation, the possibility that that could evolve over time into the kind of relationship where that person could be, or some numbers of those persons could be the people who are responsible for those, to be the health proxy or whatever. I mean, but intentionally doing that, particularly for a community where some people don't necessarily have family of origin people that they might choose. And, you know, often, even when you have that, they're not the people that you want to choose, because
Right.
they're not the ones who will make the choices that you want them to make. So you guys could be leaders in modeling how to deal with one of the worst pieces of the isolation piece, which is who's going to take care of me when I'm, or, you know, who's going to help be responsible for my care and the following up on my wishes.
Great. I'm going to call on
So,
Diane Salzberg. Diane, you want to unmute and share your thoughts or questions?
Thank you so much, Rabbi Geller, for coming today. I'm still back with the first question, what to call ourselves. I remember in the 70s, a feminist was trying to bring back crone, and somehow I just never related. But Denise, you used the word sage, and I suddenly went, we're sages. That's really actually a good word. That's number one, I think. Number two, my father died during this COVID, the quarantine, but not COVID related. And actually, it was a new ritual that evolved to have Shiva alone. You know, there was partially Zoom, but it was very much an internal, but in touch with, you know, Rabbi Denise and different things. It was definitely a different ritual, and it felt, you know, modern. I don't mean, you know, oh boy, new, but just adapting to the current situation. And third and lastly, I was in a very, there was a physical crisis. So at 32, I walked into a lawyer's office and said, I want to make a will. And he said, what are you doing here? But I knew the relief and the release of knowing your wishes are on paper, so that people are not going, what does she want? Oh no, let's fight about it. You know, it was like, I want to say certain things. And I'm so surprised when my even older adult parent, my mother, you know, oh, well, they don't want to write a will. If I don't write a will, I'm not going to die.
Right.
I find that such a strange thing. It's like, it's free. You aren't burdened. And people know at the end of life, I don't want life support, I do, you know, things like that. So that was my thoughts on those.
So again, if this pandemic makes us all realize that we are going to die and that we just can't pretend that we're not anymore, you know, if that changes our behavior in any way, and if our communities, if your synagogue, if this conversation can help change your attitude, I mean, this internalized ageism stuff, you know, we're not going to die. It's not true. We are going to die. And that makes us need to make our lives even more, you know, because we're going to die, how we live our lives is even more important. And I think that, you know, to try to frame what is something people are afraid of into something that empowers them. And Jewish tradition does that very clearly. That's what Yom Kippur is all about. It is about, we're going to die. How are we going to live our life until that moment? We don't know what that moment is. I want to encourage you to write down that ritual about how to sit Shiva alone. We need to be sharing this stuff. Your experience is Jewish experience. Somebody else can benefit from that. Someday I'll write a new book about, you know, where I'll script some of these rituals, but until then, write it down and send it to Ritual Well, and let them post it, so somebody who's looking for how to do Shiva by myself can learn.
Ritual Well?
It's called ritualwell.org, and it's a compilation of new rituals.
Great, thank you.
Beautiful. Anybody else have a Michael Beck? Come share.
Hi. Am I on?
You're on.
Okay. Getting back to the original question about what the temple community can do. Sally and I, my wife Sally, we have all the legal stuff covered. We have a living trust and all that. I asked Jane and Lisa, who are friends through the congregation, if they will make sure that our pets are taken care of when we're gone, because it's not in the will, it's not in any of the legal stuff. And I know they will. I trust them, and I feel better that, you know, my dogs won't stay at home and starve if we go down in a plane crash somewhere. So using the congregation is important.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, in addition to doing the financial planning and even the end of life planning, there's also the question of values. You know, what do you want to leave to whomever it is that you're leaving values to? The whole tradition of writing an ethical will. So the last section of the book talks about it talks about sort of how to give back, and talks about philanthropy, talks about stories, talks about stuff, and it talks about values. And one of the ways Jews do talk about values is by writing ethical wills. So, you know, take a look at that. And actually tomorrow at 4 o'clock, I am teaching a class on writing ethical wills through Chai Village LA. You're all invited. I think it will be, just go to the chaivillagela.org website, 4 o'clock, and it's a 2-3 session class about writing an ethical will. You could be doing stuff like that in the congregation, Rabbi Eger, maybe you already have, but that's also important, you know, for people to have access to that tradition.
You've given us like so much to think about. Toby, you have to unmute. There we go. How you doing there, Toby?
Yeah,
There you go. Oh, do it again. Do it one more time.
Towards the middle.
There you go.
Am I unmuted now?
You're good.
I was just thinking, my aunt is on here who's 97. But I was just thinking, I think it would be a great thing if we made a video, don't you? I mean, as I sit here alone and look at all these people on here that if we made a video and asked questions of people who are still alive at our age, what it was like when we were young and then today, because I mean, my aunt, who, if you looked at her now, you wouldn't believe she's 97, but she says in her 97 years, she's never lived through anything like this pandemic.
Right.
And to think she lived through the Depression and the wars and stuff, I just think somewhere a video of all of us who have reached, like I'm 80 now, who have reached our ages that we've reached would be wonderful for our kids to hear at some point. Don't you?
So there's a chapter in the book about how to make that video, what kinds of questions to ask. And there's a woman in LA, her name is Ellie Khan. You've probably read some of her work in the Jewish Journal. You know, you could hire her to come and do that for the congregation. Another thing for the women on this call, Jewish Women's Archive has created this thing called Story Aperture, where people interview each other. And one of the questions is, tell us about how you're dealing with this pandemic, and then that will be archived and be available to people through Jewish Women's Archive. So check it out. You can do it with your cell phone. I mean, they explain exactly how to do it. So it could be a congregational project, or it could be something that you would do individually with your aunt. And it's also a possibility for intergenerational stuff. There are teenage kids who need mitzvah points for their bar mitzvahs, and they could be interviewing some of you as well.
Welcome to Brantford.
Thank you.
I volunteer.
Right. Beautiful. Gloria, did you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Harry Nelson. But Gloria and I attended a seminar a couple of years ago. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, okay.
Go for it.
It was put on by a local hospice, and the whole seminar was based on a booklet called 5 Wishes. And I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but it doesn't take the place of a trust, but it really gets you thinking. It's kind of a workbook type of thing you can write in, and you have a place then to basically personalize what you would like. Particularly it's geared, because it was put on by a hospice, to your, basically your final, years and your, close to the end of life. But it also has a place for personalizing things. And we have used it for just getting us to think and getting us to write down important information, which we may possibly have left out of the trust. And so we just wanted to bring that to your attention if you hadn't heard of it.
Right, that it's different from a trust. 5 Wishes, or a Jewish advanced healthcare directive. It's different from your finances. We all have wills, or we should all have wills, but this is different. This is, what are the wishes around your dying? And if you fill out 5 Wishes, and the resources are in the book, if you fill it out and have it notarized, it's a legal end-of-life directive.
Well, Laura, any last minute, last thoughts?
Yes, I want to conclude. I want to say 2 things in conclusion. The first thing that I want to say is, hold on. I want to conclude with a poem, but first I want to remind you that the bottom line of what this book is about is that we need to change the way our community views growing older. That's the ultimate goal of this. In the 60s and 70s, we changed the way the Jewish community looked at young people. That's what the counterculture was about. We're the same people, and now we need to change the way our community looks at growing older.
And we can volunteer.
Absolutely, and there are ways to do that. And Rabbi Eger and I, before you guys were on, we're talking about what the Reform movement is doing in terms of a postcard campaign, and there's stuff that we can be doing from our homes that really will make a difference. But I want to leave you with this important thought, and that is that 70 is not the new 50. 70 is the new 70. Changing the way the world looks at older people begins with changing the way we look at ourselves. And we can help each other do that work together. So I want to conclude with a poem. It's the epilogue of the book by Hannah Block, the late Hannah Block. I used to study the bigger kids. They'd show and tell me how to wiggle my hips, how to razz the boys. Now I'm watching my cohort master the skills at each grade of incapacity and get promoted to the next. To the oldest, I'm a novice. These 75-year-olds, they think they know everything, says cousin Leo. He's 90. Who thinks, Leo? Who knows? We're too busy reading Gratitude and Being Mortal, passing around the revised edition of Dying for Dummies, still trying to get it right. And the young study us. The reason that this is important is that the young study us. The way we experience this stage of our life is going to change the way future generations experience this stage of their life. And in doing that, we will have changed the Jewish story. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Wow, what a wonderful, thank you for that beautiful closing. This is the book, Getting Good at Getting Older. We actually have copies at Kolami. $25 includes your shipping and handling. If you want a copy of the book, just either email or call our temple office and we'll send it out to you. You can pay for it either through check or online on our temple website, which is kol-ami.org. Laura, thank you so much for being with us and for teaching us today. So much to think about in this process, and we're just so honored. I'm always so honored to have you as my teacher, my friend, and mentor, to share your wisdom, your sage wisdom. That's the word of the day, sage. And just a quick reminder that this coming Wednesday, June 22nd, is our last section of a fabulous class with Dr. Susan Igdaloff, who's on here, of 3 important Jewish women, influential Jewish women you need to know, but don't yet. And this one's about a Jewish spy, so you don't have to have attended any of the others to enjoy this, and that will be at 6:30 on Wednesday. Again, thank you for joining us. Please consider a donation to Kolami for this great session, free session with Rabbi Geller. And again, thank you, Rabbi Geller, for your wisdom and for sharing it with us today. Thanks, everybody. We're so glad you were here to be part of this.
Stay safe.
Stay well.